our keynote of the day. And the question is, will generative AI augment or disrupt digital platforms? So generative AI has been in the news for a few months. It's a very powerful and disruptive technology. On one hand, you've got people like Goldman Sachs saying that Gen AI could raise global GDP by 7%. On the other hand, it could bring significant disruption to the job market with 300 million jobs at risk. So that's 1/4 of current jobs. Others predict doom and gloom, almost like the end of the human race. So there's a wide range of scenarios, but one thing is sure, almost everyone is going to be impacted. So let me introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Geoff Parker. So Geoff is a professor of engineering at Dartmouth College. He's also a research fellow and visiting scholar at MIT's Initiative for the Digital Economy. Geoff is very well known in the field of platforms because he's one of the leading researchers and contributors to the field of network economics. And he's also the co-developer of the theory of two-sided markets. Geoff is also co-author of the award-winning book, Platform Revolution. If you haven't read it, you have to. It's a must read. Now, I think it's very fitting to have you here today, Geoff, because I didn't know until recently that Dartmouth is considered as the birthplace of AI as a research discipline, with the first AI conference organized in 1956. It dates a while. So Geoff, welcome.
Thank you so much, Laure. Thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure.
So, I mean, Gen AI tools can help us do new things, such as creating content, helping us code, analyzing large amounts of data. But let's focus on the creation of content because it applies to so many fields. The idea that you can produce very personalized content on a prompt is both exciting and very worrying at the same time. And it has implications for lots of existing platform businesses, hasn't it?
It really does. I mean, if you go back to the basic way that we think about platforms, we think of them as matching kind of two types of users, often a content side, often a consumer, but they come in lots of different flavors and multi-sided platforms. And the goal is to create a valuable transaction. And so a lot of the way that happened or happens is you've got a thick supply side, if you will, and then a thick demand side, and then all kinds of technology that has data and it's sort of data-driven matching that then allows for the right supply to meet the right demand that creates the most value. Well, generative AI has the potential of turning that on its head. And it's not that the data isn't incredibly valuable, and we'll come to that, but the idea that you have to have a pre-existing sort of stable of supply, if you will, that you then sift through and match to the right demand may well just disappear, at least for some types of industries where you can call forth exactly what you want or something that's potentially closer to your preferences than we've ever seen before. So it's, as you say, both incredibly interesting and exciting, but also super disruptive. But then we've seen that for decades in the kind of rise of the platform economy writ large.
That's right, yes. So many of these new Gen AI tools, so ChatGPT, Bard, Claude, there are so many now. They are very powerful and easy to use. So I'd be very interested to do a quick poll with the audience and ask them how often do they use Gen AI tools. Robin, if we can pull the poll just to ask the audience really quickly whether they've used tools before. I'm sure most of you will have, but also do you use it for your work and or your personal life? And while people are answering, I can talk about my experience. I use it a lot in my work, but certainly on a personal level, I found that the OpenTable plugin on ChatGPT is really incredibly efficient for finding a restaurant that fits my criteria. And it completely redefines matching, and actually for platform practitioners, the user experience for search is completely, redefined. And also think that ChatGPT's wine pairing recommendations are amazing. I don't know now if we can see the results of the poll. Interesting. Yeah. So we've got almost 20% of people using it every day, with a bit less than 10% people that have embedded it in their daily routines. And people use it for work and life. So thank you very much for that. So I was wondering, are there any examples that you've seen on the ground with your students of how they use these tools today?
Absolutely. And, in many ways, these kind of GPTs and large language models have been around for some time, but they exploded, I think, into the public awareness really in late last fall, sort of November, December. So I teach a data analytics project lab class, and I essentially had to redesign the class, and that's on March, kind of April, May, to incorporate these things, because it would have felt completely out of date in just 6 months. And that doesn't happen that often, that you just have to scrap significant amounts of your content. But if you think about sources, sort of application areas, website development, for example, you would expect people to become much more efficient using these tools, which then either means you're going to do a lot more for end users, or fewer people are going to be kind of in that machine kind of human loop. And so similarly with coding, I found myself, I have to sometimes create a set of graphics. I don't always remember the syntax. I used to say, well, did you Google that or go to Stack Overflow? Now you just go into one of the GPTs, and if you want it in Python, say, do the following for me, and then it just pops up. That's sort of been my experience. But what we did with the students that I think is really a pretty cool project was one of the financial services firms commissioned, they sponsored a project. And the prompt was, hey, we don't want people to have to go to our website to do things like pulling moving averages of stocks or looking at various indices, which is how you would do it now, but let's make that all voice activated. And so the students are not computer science students, they're smart kind of engineering and management kids. But they embraced it. So they figured out a tool that will take voice to text. And so then they had text, but they can't really pull financials. And so then they figured out how to do prompt engineering to train an LLM to take the text, transform that into the exact syntax so that you have all of your API keys embedded. And then it can go to something like a Bloomberg, a Yahoo Finance, a Vantage Point, whatever the source was, and then pull the exact numbers, and then within the Streamlit and Python environment, just create a nice, pretty graphics. And what was absolutely stunning to me, or frightening, was students within 4 or 5 weeks put together something that's like this close to production ready. I mean, okay, production ready is too strong, but in terms of a proof of concept, you could hand that off to a team, and then they could embed it pretty quickly because all the moving parts worked. And with 250 lines of code, they called 3 major systems, embedded it, 2 different LLMs, and did the work that would have taken months, and did it in weeks. So I think that's just in a microcosm, kind of what's going on. And this is one of those areas where a lot of companies are super busy with their day-to-day. And I'm kind of used to almost being a follower on the data science side, because companies have so much data and they're moving ahead. But this may be one of those sort of disequilibrium times where the students actually have a chance to play with this tech and can actually come in and bring some pretty new ideas and new capabilities. So as you can tell, I'm pretty enthusiastic. I think it's really fun.
Impressive. Now, you've researched network effects for many years, and you're one of the leading academics on the topic. So platforms derive incredible value from network effects, but in the world of generative AI, it seems that learning effects become much more important. So what's the difference between network effects and learning effects? And are network effects as relevant in a Gen AI world, or is it more about, having the right kind of data going forward?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because if you kind of go and circle back to where we started about kind of the function of a platform. So the function being to create matches, to have valuable exchanges. And so great. That starts to get turned on its head, because now if we can start to generate that, as we noticed earlier, um, you don't necessarily need to have pre-existing content to match to, but you still have to have a ton of data. I mean, these systems are trained on massive amounts of information, and people need help. So the idea that you and I are going to um, magically be really good at calling forth what we want is probably not true. So you can kind of see a different place for intermediaries to step in, whether they're automated or whether they're humans, to help create the content, if not necessarily a system to create the matching. But if you think about network effects, our kind of prior conceptualizations of that were they increase in the number of users, they increase in the number of participants. Now, of course, we're seeing data flow, or rather a lot of value um, flow to the data itself. So I think we are going to see a shift in sort of the locus of value creation in platforms.
Okay, and so what is likely to be the impact on existing platforms? Do you think they might
So,
benefit?
great question. There's a pivot, right?
Yes.
So I think the impact is they have to think carefully about the various sources of value that they're providing to their users. And when we talk about network effects, we often will divide that simplistically into three buckets. So bucket one is your product or service. What does it do if you were just playing with it by yourself? And so a lot of, for example, social networks don't do much in the absence of other users. And so they don't have a lot of standalone value. But other things, tools like spreadsheets, have tremendous standalone value and a lot of kind of collaborative value, but not necessarily so much cross-site value. And so I think being really thoughtful about the sources of value in the system and how they're going to shift from embedded in the platform itself because it has access to data, to the collaborations that it provides, to the ecosystem connections, I would expect to see the relative fraction of value start to shift around a lot. It doesn't mean that the platforms are going away, but it means there's an adaptation coming up.
Interesting. So, I mean, Gen AI is likely to increase the productivity of many organizations, including platforms, in the sense that they're going to be able to do tomorrow what they do today more efficiently. But I suspect it will also create new markets. And we've seen, for example, marketplaces of prompts, connecting prompt engineers. That's kind of a new profession with clients. So what could be others?
Yeah, and by the way, I just thought, your example of prompt engineering as literally a market is so spot on. And we need Sherpas to help us, ask the right questions, and there's a market for that. So a couple of areas that you'd expect. So area one is you would expect to see sort of more interest in data sharing. So if you buy the premise that these systems need massive amounts of data to be trained on, and that creates value, great. That would suggest then either markets for data or data consortia and collaborations. And then fighting directly against that is, oh, wait a minute, that's all proprietary. And so now what we're going to see is actually a lot of closed sandboxes, if you will, where we're going to train these systems on proprietary data internally. Both of those are going to be forces that the platforms will have to reckon with, and they'll create new markets. So market one is sort of more data oriented, collaboration, sharing. Market two is, okay, how do you actually set these things up internally and keep them safe? Very different. But and those are just two examples. I think we're going to see some growth.
A few days ago, Bill Gates, said that Gen AI will be so profound that it could radically alter user behaviors. And, he said something along the lines that whoever wins the personal agent, will kind of win the game. With the personal agent, people won't need to go to a search site anymore. They won't need to go to a productivity site, or they won't have to go to Amazon again. So, I mean, that's quite that's quite extreme. But so could the world as we know today be that different tomorrow?
So I'm going to merge a couple of streams together. But when I first saw these, I had that Mosaic moment. I remember 30 years ago when Mosaic was released, and I went home and I showed my wife, and I was like, look, this changes everything. She's like, she's an architect and tech savvy, but wasn't doing things like fetch and doing all of the SSH and file transfer protocols types of stuff that I was. And so it didn't really see it. But I said, what this technology is doing is it's taking a lot of existing things, and this is often how we see innovation working, and then integrating them to, in effect, create a new experience or dramatically reduce a transaction cost is really what happened with the web browsers. That's what I see here, is it's that fundamental. And you saw whole new industries rise, and you saw, lots of them just simply collapse because it no longer made sense. In terms of predicting that specific firms are going to just vanish from the face of the earth, maybe, but one could have said the same thing about Microsoft decades ago, when they were so slow to pivot to literally embedding any kind of internet connectivity. And yet here they are. So I wouldn't be so fast to write off the firms that are getting described there. What I would expect to see more is a really intentional set of pivots and then adaptations to the sources of value creation.
So our next panel will be on platform regulation that was designed pre-Gen AI. Any thoughts on how these new Gen AI developments might need to be factored in?
Yeah, so, quite a few. I think one is literally thinking about access to data, who has rights to it. That's become even more important. The European Commission has actually done quite a bit of work in that area with both the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. Sort of full disclosure, we've been involved in sort of as panelists and commenting and trying to provide some feedback and improvements on those. So I think the data issue is an ownership and access, and making sure that there are rights to it, especially for those who contributed to the data sources, is one area that's kind of evergreen, if you will, on the regulatory space. The second is, I think this issue of deep fakes is both, fascinating, but absolutely creepy and scary. And I don't have a good answer on how to control that. So that's going to be one more that we just have to keep that issue front and center. And then a third one is fake information. I mean, being able to, and it kind of ties in with the deep fakes, but not knowing what's real is really problematic. And, we've already had a bunch of that. The disruption in our elections and our democratic processes, or just our social processes, I wouldn't see that slowing down. And so I think that both the firms themselves and the regulatory community have to work to understand the issues, and then, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in terms of trying things to blunt the sort of malign forces while still harnessing what's good.
Okay. One final question, actually two, but we're running out of time. So there's one question from Adam Bartnikis asking, is AI more like disruption or adaptation for platforms? And
well, I think I could pretty strongly argue both. And I know that's, you don't want a two-sided economist. So on the one hand, on the other, I think it's very disruptive for those firms that can't pivot their business model or can't pivot how they think about their internal operations and their ecosystems and where value comes from. So that's the disruption. And then the augmentation is, if you think about who has the best data, it's the big platforms. And if you kind of buy the premise that, hey, this supercharges access to data, then you have to believe that they're in a really good position. So that's why you get this sort of on the one hand, on the other, which I know no one loves, but I think in this case, it's accurate.
Okay, so thank you so much for your insights, Geoff. Just to close our discussion, if you had to encapsulate your vision in a few words and complete the sentence, the future of platforms is, what would it be?
Oh, I think the future of platforms is always adapting. It's unstable, but it never has been stable. And so I think we'll continue to see them make progress, particularly into traditional businesses, where sort of up the B2B and up the manufacturing supply chains, there's been tremendous sort of rigidity. I think that will continue, or even that change will accelerate. So I think nobody gets to ignore these forces, and that rate of change or the timeline in having to ingest an understanding, and then honestly these tools into your sort of organizations and the way you create value is just going to increase. So that's kind of what I see.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Geoff. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laure. That's been great. And thanks, everyone.